Greetings, traveler. I am SnapJelly, and quite often people ask me something along the lines of, what is the best sword ever? And every time somebody asks me that, I have to say the same thing, which is, I can't say. There is no answer to the question, what is the best sword ever? Because what I would tell you, and what any other HEMA practitioner would probably also tell you, is that the best sword depends on the scenario that you're in. If you don't give me context, I can't answer that question. Just giving you an example, what I would tell you is the most all-round weapon to use is simply a longsword. But on the other hand, if you're in a really restricted area, like a dense forest, or like even a toilet booth or something, who knows, then all of a sudden an arming sword, or even a dagger, doesn't seem like that bad of an idea, does it? I mean, quite simply, the length of a longsword doesn't allow you to use it in restricted spaces. I actually have that problem right here. If I try to show you things, I just don't have room here. So, a longsword is a really good weapon in a lot of situations, but not in every situation. So what is the best weapon? Depends on where you are. If you're in an open field, use a pole arm, right? If you're in a very small restricted space, use a dagger. If your opponent is wearing armor, use a pole axe or a warhammer. It depends on the scenario. So if you don't give me a scenario, I can't answer that question. Now, the reason it is this way is because you can't design a perfect weapon. You see, what happened is that most weapons are designed to be specialized to do a certain thing very well. Like, for example, pick rapiers, right? Rapiers are very long, they're very thin, very pointy. They are designed to be thrusters. But they still have edges. You can still cut with them. Now, if you would compare a rapier to a falchion, then, of course, the rapier is gonna outstab the falchion. But the falchion is gonna outcut the rapier. Simple as that. You can still stab with a falchion, you can still cut with a rapier, but they are designed to do a specific thing. And that's what they're good at. Now, if you would design an all-around weapon, you don't get a weapon that's good at everything, you get a weapon that's mediocre at everything. So if you have a sword that is average at everything, then what happens is, as soon as you encounter somebody with a rapier, he is gonna outstab you. His weapon will have more reach, more tip control, because your weapon is also good at cutting a little bit, so you would have less tip control, more thwack, but he has more reach and you are gonna die. Now, similar to that, if you would have an all-around weapon and your opponent would be wearing a falchion, and you would have light armor, for example, let's say gambeson, then your opponent is gonna have an easier time getting through your armor than you are gonna have getting through his. Because his sword packs more of a punch. So what happened in history is that most weapons just evolved in multiple branches and just had separate branches to be specialized at different things. So different units would be good at different things. So you can't make a perfect weapon. A weapon is always a compromise. You would be good at something and lack at something else. You could still do it, but just not as good. So there is no perfect weapon. It is impossible to make a weapon that's good at everything. But it's not impossible to make a weapon that is bad at everything. Da-da-da-da, incoming. The 1796 pattern British Infantry Officer's Sword. Now, this is arguably the worst sword ever. Yes, now, before I say anything, I want to say that what I usually point at when people criticize specific weapons for being bad is that if it was used in history a lot, it was most likely good at something. Because if it's not practical, people wouldn't use it. So before I made this video, I actually did a little bit of research, and it turns out that a lot of officers during the War of the Roses actually despised these weapons as well, and used other types of sabers, or even daggers instead of these. So my criticism is not completely invalid. You see, when I say worst sword ever, I don't mean that it's a bad sword. I mean, depends on what you're looking for. This sword can still do everything a sword is supposed to do. It can cut, it can stab, it can parry, it can do anything. There are some nicks in the blade there. I don't know if you're able to see that, but so it has been used. It does everything a sword is supposed to do, but not only is this sword not specialized to do a specific thing, it is also simply outclassed by other sabers on every perspective. In both protectiveness, in cutting power, and in stabbing power, it is just outclassed by this sword is better at cutting, better at stabbing, and it is longer too, quite a bit. It's also curved. Even with the curvature, it's still longer. This sword is just, it's better than this one. And that's pretty odd. I don't know why they thought this design was a good idea, because I am honestly not convinced that that it was smart just saying that, because there were other designs available, earlier designs that were actually better than this. And I'm just gonna give you a quick rundown as to why this sword is so terrible. Where do I even start? Alright, let's start at the blade, alright? It's a saber. Now, sabers are generally designed to be cutting weapons, right? This sword is clearly not. You see, the blade is a spadroon blade. Yes, and what's a spadroon? Well, a spadroon is a gentleman's weapon. It was used in duels. It's very light. It's designed to be comfortable to wear, not for actual warfare. But this is supposed to be a war sword. So they're putting a really light blade, a dueling blade, on a war sword. Makes no sense, and that comes with its downsides. Namely, one, it's incredibly thin, as you can see. Well, narrow, I should say. It's also very, very thin, and that makes the blade really light. Now, you could say that's a good thing, but it just does not have the cutting power you want. That's one. Two is the edge is generally really small. This is not something that is particularly the problem of this design. It's just something that happens on early swords. But as you can see, the fuller is really wide, and the edge is just not that big. And this is the part where you're supposed to cut with the sword, and the edge is even smaller there. I don't know if you're able to see that. It's pathetically tiny, and that decreases cutting power. Also, it's not curved, which once again decreases cutting power, but weirdly, it does have a false edge. A little bit. Just here, just a tip. So it was definitely designed for cutting, while it is not designed for cutting. It's weird. I don't know what's going on with that. Now, judging by its width, you could say that this is a thruster, but like I just showed you, it's not very long. That's one. Most thrusters would, of course, be very long. And two is, just get a cloth right here. This blade is incredibly flexible. This takes no effort whatsoever to do. This is just, it is such a light blade. It's fascinating to me, because this sword, I don't see it happening. If you fighting somebody with just a thick jacket or something and you stab that, I don't see this sword actually going through. That's how flexible it is. That it takes no strength whatsoever to just bend it. And also the tip isn't specifically impressive either. Just looking at that again, coming close. As you can see, the taper, it just goes up gradually at a fairly straight, actually. The blade is fairly straight, and then at the end it just kind of tapers down into a point. Whereas if it would just gradually taper down into a point, it will be way pointier. So it is also not designed for the thrust. The blade is very flexible, and also, now that I note it, it doesn't have particularly much tip control either. What you see on thruster weapons is that all of the weight is going to be in the handle, so that you can move the blade. But this definitely feels balanced like a saber. For the chop, not for the thrust, so it's not a thruster either. Now, talking about the hilt, as you can quite clearly see, it's not very big on hand protection. It's not that impressive. You have this double shell guard, as it is called, and a very, very thin knuckle bow. And that's it. It doesn't really look impressive. Also, it's made out of brass, which is really common, but it's, again, not that good of a material. There are, in later sabers, hilts were always made out of steel, and that is because there are a lot of writings of hilts just completely breaking. And even more impressive hilts than this just being sliced through. It's not something that you really rely on to protect your hand. It's more like a last resort. And I don't see this thin-ass knucklebow really protecting your hand. Also, what you see in a lot of examples is that these shells here actually bent or broken off. In this example, also this one is kind of bent more towards the hand than the other one. That's because, well, if they fall or fall over or you get a strike on that, well, there's nothing supporting it. It's just held up by the strength of the material, and brass is not that strong. Steel is definitely stronger, and thus brass hilts were often broken during battle. And now there is the little hand protection that there is it's incredibly thin. I don't see this blocking this type of blade. This will definitely go through there with a full power blow. So the knucklebow will break and it's bye-bye fingers, and oh, we're all not happy. Another thing is just generally this kind of double shell guard, or figure of 8 guard, however you would call it, was not particularly popular. You see it in various kinds of swords, but not a lot. There wasn't a lot of this. And one of the main reasons why is because it's very uncomfortable. Yes, as you would wear this on your hip, this shell is going to be poking into your side, and that's uncomfortable, but they had a solution for that. Look at this. Whoop. I feel like I'm in a cartoon. I wish I was joking, but no, this side, on a lot of examples, not all of them, but a lot of them, you can move this, there are joints in there, so that it's easier to carry, so that it wouldn't bother you when you're carrying it on your hip. So if you would draw this sword, you would have to draw it, and then you would have to do this down like that, and there you go, then you could start. How ridiculous is that? The hilt is already made of brass. It's not very impressive, right? It's not supported, these shells are not supported by anything, just the strength of the material, and then you're gonna even weaken the material by putting joints in there. Like, who came up with this? Honestly, it's dumb. I'm just sorry to put it out just blunt like that, but it's honestly, it's just dumb. I can't wrap my head around it. So, in conclusion, the guard is shit. Lastly, the hilt. The hilt, it looks very funky. I mean, it's just kind of like a wrapping, just very round. But honestly, it's not uncomfortable to hold. It's a little bit of a plus. But on the other hand, it is kind of small. Right? It is supposed to be a saber. Well, some people call this a spadroon. I would say it's a saber. But for a saber, it's kind of weird that it doesn't allow the saber grip. It's too small. Your thumb is going to be jammed up there. My hands are not particularly big, so somebody with slightly larger hands would not be able to do this grip, and that is weird. It's the saber grip, and you can't do it on a saber. How does that make sense? You are forced to hold this either hammer grip or handshake grip, and it's honestly, it's just odd. You also can't finger the guard, as it's called. It's when you put one finger over the guard like this, because of the shells here. Well, you just can't. There's no room. You can't. The shells are in the way. So you are forced to hold it this way and nothing else. And that's just odd. I mean, people have different preferences. You can hold a sword multiple ways, and people hold it the way that they like. And then you would create a sword that forces you to have a specific grip. Now, there were multiple swords that did this, like, for example, this one, right here. This type of hilt, it forces you into a hammer grip as well. You can't really, honestly, you can't move this sword around very much. But they adapted the fighting style, right? That's why the sword is so curved. Because as you swing, you would have to get very close, but you would have a lot of blade contact as the sword collides with your opponent. But that sword doesn't have that. You see, this sword is specialized to do those type of cuts. And you can see that in the hilt and in the blade. And that sword is specialized for nothing. But it does force your hand in a specific position. That's weird. What else can I say about it? Well, not that much. The pommel looks a bit weird, regardless of if you like it or not. I think I've summed it up about it. I do not dislike the sword. I gotta say that. I actually like it. It's very fun. It's light. It's a fun little blade. I'd love to get a reproduction as well, just to see how well it performs. And when I sell this, I will be very glad to get a new one if I find a good price. So, yeah, that's about it. The 1796 pattern British Infantry Officer Sword. Arguably the worst sword ever. If you stuck around this long, you might as well subscribe. Also follow me on Facebook, facebook.com/SnapJelly, link in the description below. And thank you for joining my quest. And I hope you'll join me in the next one. Bye guys. Bye.